The fourth plate was the first thing Henry noticed every evening, and the last thing he could bring himself to move. It sat at the corner of the plank table, turned just slightly the way Clara used to set it, edge aligned with the groove in the wood she'd worn smooth, tracing it with her thumb while she talked. Eliza set it there without being asked. She had done it since she was old enough to reach the shelf, and Henry had never told her to stop. He didn't know how. The words for that conversation lived somewhere he hadn't found yet, somewhere past the grief that still lay across his chest most mornings, like a second blanket he never asked for. He would stand at the stove, stirring whatever thin supper he'd managed, and watch his daughter arrange 4 plates, with the solemn care of a child who believes very hard in something. She was 5 years old, and she believed her mother was coming back to supper. Henry stirred and said nothing and prayed, in the wordless way a man prays when he has run out of the right language, that someone or something would help him figure out what to say to her before she was old enough to know exactly what he wasn't saying. That winter came early to Harlan Creek, the way bad winters always do, without apology and without warning. The first snow fell in October, a hard gray curtain that turned the mountains behind the valley into suggestions of themselves. Henry's cattle were fewer than they'd been the year before, and his hay was short, and his fence line on the north pasture had 2 sections down that he hadn't gotten to before the ground froze. He was not a man who complained. He was 34 years old, lean and dark-haired with hands that had been calloused since he was 12, and he had built everything on this spread from the frame up. But building a thing and keeping it running were 2 different kinds of work, and he was one man, and Eliza needed tending, and some mornings when he went out to the barn before dawn, the sheer arithmetic of what he had to do in a day sat on him the way that second blanket did. He had been alone nearly 3 years. The letter came on a Thursday, tucked between a feed invoice and a notice from the county recorder's office about a disputed water claim on Harlan Creek that Henry couldn't afford to fight and couldn't afford to lose. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was plain. The words inside were plain, too, and it was the plainness of them that made him read the letter twice, standing in the cold outside the post office, his breath coming in small clouds in the November air. My name is Rose Calloway. I am 28 years of age, in good health, and honest in my dealings. I am a capable cook, a fair hand with livestock, and I know how to work. I am not looking for sentiment. I am looking for a fair arrangement that benefits both parties. I have heard through Mrs. Aldridge that you may be in need of a housekeeper or a wife. I am willing to discuss either. I expect plain dealing in return. Henry read it a 3rd time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket and drove the wagon home through the snow, thinking about a woman he had never met, who had described herself as honest, the way another person might describe the weather. He wrote back that same evening. He told her the truth about the spread, the cattle count, the fence, the water claim, and Eliza. He told her about Eliza last, and then he read what he'd written, and crossed it out, and wrote it again, putting Eliza first this time, because that was where she belonged. The reply came in 12 days, 2 sentences. I am willing to meet. I will arrive on the 14th if that suits. It suited. He met her at the depot in Harlan on a Tuesday afternoon that was cold enough to make the platform boards creak underfoot. He recognized her before she'd stepped fully off the train. Not because he had any description of her, but because she was the only woman who came down the steps, carrying a single worn traveling bag in one hand, and looking at the platform with the expression of someone arriving to assess a job rather than begin an adventure. She was of medium height, with dark red hair pulled back severely under a practical gray hat, and brown eyes that moved over the depot, the street beyond it, and then Henry himself with the same steady attention she'd likely given everything else. He took off his hat. She nodded. Mr. Henry Voss. Miss Calloway. You look tired, she said. It was not unkind. It was simply accurate, the way a good doctor states a thing. "It's been a long season," he said. "They generally are." She looked past him at the wagon. "Is the child with you?" "She's home with my neighbor, Mrs. Purcell. I didn't want to bring her out in this cold." Rose nodded again, as if that were the right answer. "Good. Shall we go?" He took her bag. She did not argue about it, but she kept pace with him exactly, stride for stride, and he had the distinct impression she was the kind of woman who would have carried it herself quite readily if he hadn't. They drove the 6 miles to the ranch mostly in silence. The snow lay even and white on either side of the road. The mountains behind the valley were entirely hidden today. "The letter said you have a water claim dispute," she said, somewhere around the 3rd mile. "County's trying to reroute the creek access for the Harlan Land and Ditch Company. If they get the easement, I lose the right to water the north pasture direct from the creek. Can you fight it? Need a lawyer I can't pay, and a surveyor's report I can't afford." She was quiet a moment. "My father was a surveyor. I learned to read a plat map young." Henry looked at her sideways. "I mention it," she said, "because it may be relevant." "It may," he said. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, the main house with its gray board siding, the barn beyond, the smaller outbuilding that served as a chicken coop and storage both. He watched her look at it the way she'd looked at everything else, steadily, without flinching. "It needs paint," he said. "Most places do," she said, and got down from the wagon before he could help her. Inside, Mrs. Purcell had the stove going, and Eliza was at the table with a piece of string she'd been making shapes with. She looked up when they came in, and her eyes went straight to Rose with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. Rose looked back at her with the same frank directness, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Eliza said, "Are you going to eat supper with us?" "If your father will have me," Rose said. Henry hung his coat. "Set a plate, Eliza." Eliza slid off her chair and went to the shelf, and Henry watched her count the plates out loud the way she always did, her small lips moving. "One for Papa, one for me. One for—" She paused at the 3rd plate, the way she always did. "One for Mama." She set it in its corner. Then she reached for a 4th plate and set it at the 4th side of the table, and something in Henry's chest shifted a 1/4 inch, like a stone rolling just slightly off where it had been lodged. Rose did not remark on the extra plate. She saw it. He was sure she saw it, because she saw everything. But she said only, "I'll help with the stew," and went to the stove as if she had been there before. Mrs. Purcell left with the brief, meaningful look of a woman who is filing this moment away to discuss with at least 3 neighbors. Henry did not mind. He had lived in this valley long enough to know that privacy was a courtesy people here extended in theory and recalled when they got home. Supper was venison stew that Rose had quietly improved in the last 15 minutes, adding something from her bag that turned out to be dried thyme, and cornbread that Henry had made that morning, and that was admittedly better with her opinion on it, which had been delivered as a single lifted eyebrow and then a suggestion about the heat of the pan. Eliza ate steadily and watched Rose the entire time. Rose answered questions as they came, in full sentences, without talking down. "Why is your hair red?" Eliza asked. "It came that way," Rose said. "Mama's hair was brown." "I know," Rose said, and she didn't. But it was the right answer all the same. Henry turned his spoon in his bowl and said nothing and listened to the two of them. After supper, Eliza helped clear the table without being asked, which she always did, and Henry noticed that she left Clara's plate for last. She stood looking at it for a moment, then picked it up and carried it to the basin with the others. He had never seen her do that before. He thought about it later that night, after he'd shown Rose the small room at the back of the house that had been a parlor and was now a bedroom because needs changed, and after he'd heard the lamp go out under her door. He sat by the stove with the cold pressing at the windows. and thought about a child who set an empty place at supper every night, and a woman who had sat down at the fourth plate without commentary and eaten her stew and talked about time. There were terms to discuss. That was tomorrow's work. The terms took longer than he expected, not because either of them was unreasonable, but because both of them were thorough. They sat at the kitchen table the next morning with coffee between them, and laid out the shape of the arrangement, like a surveyor laying out a plat map, which Rose had noted was something she could do, and which Henry had not forgotten. He would provide room, board, and wages. He named a figure that was lower than he wished it were, and she did not flinch. She would keep the house, assist with livestock morning and evening, and manage Eliza's care during the days Henry worked the range. On Sundays, she would have the afternoon to herself. He would extend the same arrangement for a trial period of 60 days, and at the end of 60 days, they would assess. "And if the assessment goes badly," she asked, "then you'll have 60 days' wages and references, and I'll drive you to the depot myself." She considered this. "And if it goes well?" He looked at his coffee. "Then we'll discuss the other arrangement, the more permanent one. Marriage." "Yes." She was quiet long enough that the stove ticked twice. "I want it said plainly now," she said, "that I'm not coming to this as a woman looking to be taken care of. I'm coming to it as a partner in a working concern. I know that. And the child, Eliza." She said the name carefully, the way you say the name of something you intend to treat with care. "I will not replace her mother. I know that, and I wouldn't try. But if I'm here, I'll be present with her fully. I don't know how to be partial." Henry looked up from his coffee. "That's fine," he said, and meant it more than the two words held. She held out her hand across the table the way a man would, straight and direct. He shook it. Her grip was firm, and her palm was calloused from work, and it was the most human touch he'd had in a very long time. 60 days is a long time when winter is making itself known, and it is a short time when you are watching something build. Rose had come in November, and by December she had learned the rhythm of the ranch the way a good hand learns it, by watching first and doing second, and asking only the questions that mattered. She did not rearrange anything in the kitchen without telling him. She did not make changes to Eliza's routine without asking first, but she was present in the house in a way that the house seemed to notice, the way a fire notices fresh wood. She mended. He had not known how much needed mending until he saw her working through it systematically on Sunday evenings, the pile of shirts and Eliza's dresses and torn grain sacks diminishing week by week. She baked bread on Wednesdays, and the whole house smelled like it for 2 days. She kept an account book of the household expenses, small and neat, and once showed Henry where 3 weeks of careful buying had left $12 extra in the tin on the shelf. She didn't announce it as an achievement. She showed him the numbers and waited while he looked at them. "That's good work," he said. "It's arithmetic," she said. He thought about that afterward. It was arithmetic, and she was right, but it was arithmetic done with intention, and intention was what he'd been short on since Clara died. Eliza attached herself to Rose the way a child attaches to warmth, gradually and then completely. It began with questions, which Eliza had an endless supply of, and Rose answered all of them, including the ones that made Henry look up from his work, expecting her to redirect. When Eliza asked why her mother had gone to heaven, Rose said, "I don't know exactly, but I think she went so you could be here, and being here is important." Eliza had considered this for a long time, and then nodded, and gone back to her string shapes. Henry had been in the doorway and had not said anything. By the 3rd week, Rose was braiding Eliza's hair in the mornings, not because she'd offered, but because Eliza had climbed up on the stool in front of the small mirror and handed her the brush without a word, the way children assign trust, without ceremony. Henry watched this and felt something he could not name, something that lived alongside gratitude and beside grief and had its own country that he hadn't found the border of yet. He said nothing about it. He was not a man who spoke about interior country, but he built a second chair for the front porch on the first Sunday in December, when the weather was thin and cold but workable, and he set it next to the one that had always been his. He did not say why. He did not have to. She found it the next morning and sat in it with her coffee without remarking on it, looking out at the snow-covered yard with the same steady attention she gave everything, and that was enough. The water claim arrived in full force in January, which was the worst possible time, and therefore exactly when Henry should have expected it. A man named Garrett Flint came out from the Harlan Land and Ditch Company on a Thursday morning when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the barn door hard to open, and he stood in the yard with two men behind him and a paper in his hand and the expression of someone who has done this before and expects it to go the usual way. Henry came out of the barn. Rose came out of the house. Flint looked at her. He looked at Henry. He handed over the paper. "Filed easement claim," he said. "Companies asserting prior right to the north branch of Harlan Creek under the 69 Territory Code. You'll need to vacate the water access by the 1st of February. Henry read the paper. He read it again. "That code applies to original territorial claim filings," Rose said from 2 feet to his left, "which requires documentation of continuous use filed before statehood. Idaho has been a state since '90. Has the company filed documentation of continuous use under state authority?" Flint looked at her more carefully this time. "Ma'am, this is a legal matter." "I read plat maps," she said. "I read county filings. My father was a surveyor. If the company's claim rests on a territorial code, it requires a continuity filing under state law, and the county recorder's office is required to provide that filing for public inspection. Has it been filed?" The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "We'll be in touch," Flint said. He and his men rode out. Henry stood in the yard with the paper still in his hand and the cold pressing at the back of his neck, and watched them go. "It hasn't been filed," Rose said. "I'd bet my wages on it." "They're counting on you not knowing to ask. How do you know this?" "My father spent 15 years watching land companies do exactly this to small operators in 3 different territories. He taught me what to look for." She paused. "We should go to the recorder's office before they do." Henry looked at her. She was standing in the January cold in her coat, with her breath clouding in front of her, and her expression was the same as it had been on the depot platform the day she arrived, calm and steady, and entirely without panic. "All right," he said. They drove to Harlan the next morning. Rose went through the public records at the county office with the focused patience of a woman who had done this kind of work before, and by noon she had what she needed, which was the absence of the continuity filing that Flint's easement rested on. The county clerk, a small man named Higgins, who had clearly not expected a ranch wife to come in requesting plat records, watched her with an expression Henry recognized as reassessment. She laid out what she'd found at the kitchen table that evening, in terms plain enough for Henry to follow and precise enough to hold up under scrutiny, and Henry listened to all of it and then said, "We'll need it in writing to take to a lawyer." "I've already drafted it." She set 3 pages of neat handwriting on the table beside the plat map. "I know we can't afford a lawyer's time, but we can afford a letter." Henry looked at the 3 pages and the map and his capable, plain-spoken, red-haired housekeeper who had described herself as honest and had not once been anything else, and he felt the stone in his chest roll another 1/4 inch. "Thank you," he said. "It's arithmetic," she said again, and he almost smiled. The 60 days came to their end on a gray morning in January, with a new snow falling outside and the stove going, and Eliza at the table coloring a picture she'd been working on for 3 days, and Henry understood as he drank his coffee that he had known for some time now what he intended to say. and that the knowing had been living quietly in him while he watched her braid Eliza's hair and read plat maps and improve his stew with dried thyme she'd brought from somewhere he'd never asked about. He waited until Eliza was absorbed in her picture. 60 days are up, he said. They are, Rose said. She was at the window, looking out at the snow, and she did not turn around yet. The assessment? Yes. It went well, he said. She turned then. She looked at him with those steady brown eyes. It did, she said. He stood up from the table. He was not a man who made speeches. He had never been. Clara used to say he communicated in complete sentences only under duress, and that she had learned to read the rest. He thought about that, and thought about Eliza at the table behind him, who had stopped moving her crayon, who was listening the way children listen when they know something is happening and aren't sure if they're supposed to know. I'm asking you to stay, he said, not as a housekeeper, as a partner, as my wife, if you're willing. I can't offer you much beyond this place and steady work and one small girl who thinks you're something remarkable, and I believe she's right. The snow fell outside. The stove ticked. Henry, Rose said, and it was the first time she had said his given name, and it sat in the air of the kitchen differently than anything else had sat there in 3 years. Yes, she said. It was not a large wedding. The Reverend Marsh came out on a Saturday at the end of January when the weather was clear enough to make the road passable, and he stood in the kitchen with Mrs. Purcell and old Donahue from the next property over as witnesses. Eliza stood beside Rose and held her hand during the ceremony. Not because anyone told her to, but because she reached up and took it, and Rose held on with the same steadiness she gave everything. When it was over and the Reverend had shaken Henry's hand and Mrs. Purcell had cried in the way she did at most events that gave her an excuse to, and old Donahue had said, "Well done," to the room generally and gone out to see about his horse, Eliza looked up at Rose with the particular seriousness of a 5-year-old who has decided something. "You can have Mama's chair," she said. "You've been using the new one, but you can have hers if you want." Rose crouched down to her level. "I like the new one," she said. "Your papa built it for me. Let's keep your Mama's where it is." Eliza thought about this. "Okay," she said, "but I'm going to set 5 plates at supper, because now there are 4 of us, but I'm still going to set 1 for Mama." Henry was standing at the window and did not trust himself to speak. "That sounds right to me," Rose said. That evening at supper, Eliza arranged 5 plates on the table, with great ceremony, explaining the logic of each one as she went. 1 for Papa, 1 for me, 1 for Rose, 1 for the baby. Henry looked up sharply. Eliza pointed to Rose's midsection with the confident authority of a child who has overheard more than the adults realized and said, "Mrs. Purcell told Mr. Donahue when they thought I was in the barn." Rose's expression did something complicated. Henry's did too. Then Rose laughed, which was not a sound Henry had heard from her yet, and it was a good sound, clear and unguarded, the way a window sounds when you open it in spring and the air comes through clean for the first time in months. "And the 5th plate?" Henry said. Eliza had already answered that. She went back to the shelf, very precise, and brought 1 more plate to the table and set it in the worn corner, aligned just slightly with the groove in the wood. "That one's still for Mama," she said. "She likes to know supper's ready." Henry looked at his daughter. He looked at his wife, who was watching Eliza with an expression he recognized now, as the one she wore when something mattered, and she intended to hold it without breaking it. He looked at the 5 plates on the plank table in the lamplight with the snow outside and the stove going and the smell of the thyme Rose had added to the stew, and he understood something he had not known how to name for 3 years. A house does not wait, it fills. Not all at once and not without grief, but it fills with what comes to it when you leave the door open. Eliza had always known this. She had been setting that extra plate for 3 years, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood perfectly, the way only a child can, that love holds space as long as you let it. Rose had sat down at that table and held the space too, without claiming it, without diminishing it, and in doing so had made room for herself that no one had to give up anything to grant her. That is the quiet miracle of a generous heart. It expands the table rather than dividing it. If you have ever sat down at a place someone saved for you without knowing who you'd be, you know what Henry felt that night. If you've ever had a child take your hand because they decided to trust you, you know what Rose felt. And if you have ever set a plate for someone who couldn't come to supper, and kept doing it, and had that faithfulness repaid in ways you never expected, well, then you know what Eliza knew from the very beginning. This is the kind of love that gets built in winter and opens in spring and feeds people for years. Leave a comment below and tell us, has a child ever taught you something about love that you couldn't have learned any other way? We'd love to hear your story, and if these tales from the frontier speak to something in your heart, please subscribe and journey with us. There's always more road ahead and more stories worth telling. Good night. God bless you and all those gathered around your table.